Most people imagine wars being fought with bullets and bombs, but some of the greatest wars in history were fought with printing presses, interest rates, and exchange rates. These are wars you will never read about in high school history books, wars where armies did not march, but nations melted away. These are financial wars, and once you begin to see them, you realize they shaped the rise and fall of empires as much as a general's moves on the battlefield. If you think this is only about economics, you are mistaken. Currency wars decide who eats, who starves, who has a voice, and who bows down. And even today, they are waged silently, invisibly, but their consequences reach into every dollar in your pocket. The aim of a currency war is simple: to use money as power. That can mean deliberately devaluing your currency to make exports cheaper, flooding markets with cheap credit to destabilize rivals, or hoarding gold to squeeze those in need. On the surface, it looks like a clever strategy. In reality, it is the chemical warfare model of economic history. You can poison your enemy, but what if you poison yourself too? One modern example occurred during the Great Depression. After the 1929 stock market crash, economies were dragged into conflict. Nations desperately tried to market their goods abroad to survive. But as global demand collapsed, they resorted to competitive devaluations. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931. The pound fell. The U.S. reduced the gold content of the dollar in 1933. France, Italy, Japan, everyone raced to cheapen their money. Instead of boosting trade, it triggered what economists called a beggar-thy-neighbor spiral. Imports became more expensive, living standards worsened, and the tensions paved the way to World War II. Currency wars did not begin in the 1930s. The Roman Empire fought its own version 2,000 years ago. Back then, the currency was the silver denarius, and Rome's power rested on its reliability. But as the empire expanded and wars grew costly, emperors found a tempting shortcut. They mixed silver with cheaper metals, increasing supply while claiming it was still the same money. At first, the difference was small, a little less silver, a little more copper. But over time, the silver content fell from 100% to below 5%. This was the ancient version of running the printing press, and the result was predictable: inflation, loss of trust, and eventually, economic crisis. The barbarians at the gates were not the only problem. Rome had sabotaged itself from within. Fast forward to the 20th century. After World War II, the global financial system was rebuilt at Bretton Woods. The U.S. dollar was tied to gold, other currencies were tied to the dollar. This system aimed to end currency wars by fixing exchange rates, but it created a new power dynamic. Because the U.S. controlled dollar and gold demand, it could project money and power worldwide. Countries that crossed the line faced financial pressure instead of direct military conflict. Quieter, cleaner, and often more effective, and more dangerous. But this dominance came at a cost. By the late 1960s, the U.S. was printing more dollars than it could back with gold to finance the Vietnam War and domestic programs. Foreign governments noticed and began converting their dollars into gold. Facing a run on Fort Knox, President Richard Nixon shocked the world in August 1971. He closed the gold window, ending the dollar's convertibility into gold. Overnight, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. The world entered an era of floating exchange rates and a new age of currency wars. One of the most brutal modern examples in the 1980s has been largely forgotten. Japan was rising fast. Its trade surplus with the U.S. was growing, and Washington was displeased. In 1985, the U.S., Japan, West Germany, France, and the U.K. signed the Plaza Accord. The goal was to weaken the U.S. dollar and strengthen the yen and the mark. On paper, it looked like a move for trade balance. In reality, it was a coordinated currency war. The yen doubled in value within 2 years, making Japanese exports expensive.
Japan's asset bubble inflated, then burst in the 1990s, leading to decades of stagnation. The U.S. never fired a shot. It used currency markets like artillery. Currency wars rarely look like wars in real time. They appear as policy debates, interest rate decisions, or international summits, but the casualties are real. Factories close, unemployment rises, savings evaporate. In the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the Thai baht collapsed under speculative attacks, forcing the government to abandon its dollar peg. The crisis spread to Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia. Currencies plunged, economies shrank, millions were pushed into poverty overnight. Today, economists call this Currency War 4.0. The tools have changed. Central banks slash interest rates to zero or negative. They launch quantitative easing programs, flooding markets with liquidity. Sanctions are weaponized to freeze assets and cut countries off from global payment systems. The U.S. and China are locked in a subtle but high-stakes struggle over monetary influence. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency, but China is pushing for the internationalization of the yuan, building alternative payment networks, and stockpiling gold. The 2020 pandemic turned this slow war into a sprint. Governments printed vast amounts of money. In the U.S., trillions of dollars were created in less than 2 years. At first, the effect seemed manageable. Stock markets rose, unemployment fell, consumption increased, but the bill always comes due. By 2022, inflation hit a 40-year high. The Fed began aggressively raising interest rates. This sent shockwaves worldwide. A strong dollar made imports more expensive for other countries, fueled debt crises in places like Sri Lanka, and pushed weak currencies to the edge. History shows currency wars rarely end cleanly. They usually continue until something breaks. A currency collapses, a new system emerges, or political instability forces change. In the 17th century, the Dutch guilder dominated world trade. In the 19th century, it was the British pound. In the 20th century, the dollar took over. Each transition was messy, filled with wars, bankruptcies, and economic turmoil. Now the question is what comes next. Will the dollar last another 50 years? Will a multipolar system emerge? Or will decentralized cryptocurrencies disrupt the old order? The most dangerous aspect of currency wars is that ordinary people often don't even notice them. When a bomb falls, you hear it, but when a currency loses 20% of its value, you only notice when grocery prices and rent rise. By the time headlines catch up, the damage is already done. That's why financial education is critical. If you understand the patterns, how inflation erodes real wealth, how central banks and governments use the financial system as a tool of power projection, you can protect yourself. Assets.